Okay, hi, thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit, not really about the history of the building, which Sean from Minefield is going to do in a minute, but I kind of want to give you a sense of what Detroit would have been like at the time that the building came up. So you guys are all aware that Detroit is a really old city, right? Yeah? Okay. So like 300 plus years of history in this strange little town. And I think that in my research I've seen that this conflict kind of comes up again and again, and it's really almost an existential crisis, and it's really at the heart of what Detroit is, which is, are we going to be an old city? Are we going to honor our history and build on our history and talk about our history when we talk about who we are and what we're doing here? Or do we need to move past our history and be constantly pushing forward and charging ahead and literally clearing a path through the wilderness to get where we need to go? Do we tear down a building that's in our way? Do we invite new people to come here and bring new ideas, and are we welcoming of that? Do we need to learn about our history and talk about our history and tell that as part of our story, or do we need to let go of our history so that we can move on to new things? And this comes up for 300 years of Detroit history. We've been thinking about this and wondering what to do. So I've been thinking a lot about this building as a really great example of that conflict. The cornerstone of this building was laid in 1899. And 1899 was a really amazing time in Detroit. If you can just think about what it would be like to be on the eve of the 20th century, looking back at Detroit over the past 100 years. So I know I only have a few minutes, so this is going to be really rapid. But if you can just bear with me, you have to start at 1796 at the very latest. That was the year that Detroit became an American city. At that time, about 500 people lived in the city of Detroit. In 1805, the entire city of Detroit burned to the ground. Nobody was even really sure if there would be a Detroit after 1805. Thank goodness there was. We worked it out. In 1812, we were surrendered to the British in the War of 1812. It was not a sure thing that Detroit would ever be an American city again. It was in 1813. In the 1830s, due to a couple of decades of really aggressive sort of pioneering incentives, Detroit started to see an influx of immigrants from all over the country, immigrants and people within the country coming to Detroit and then moving westward to settle. So in 1830, you had about 2,000 people living in Detroit. In the 1830s, about 2,000 people were coming to Detroit a day and moving from Detroit outward into the rest of the wilderness. So in the 1850s, you saw Detroit kind of, it was still a frontier town. About 26,000 people lived here in 1850. There were still like pigs and cattle in the street, and it was muddy, and people were always complaining about all of the cattle everywhere. Like, why is this in my street? It's in my way. You still had like lost souls sitting at a tavern and drinking whiskey all day, but you started to see this real economy emerging in the 1850s. I'm going to move really fast through like 30 years of Detroit industry, but starting in the 1850s, you had distilleries, grocers, you had shipbuilders and rail yards, and you had lumber barons, and you had newspapers, and you had opulent hotels, and you had consumer goods manufacturers, people making shoes, people making beer, people making clothing. And by the 1870s, I've lost track of my numbers now. I know you're all tweeting this too, so I don't want to give you any misinformation. I know that in the 1880s, we had about 116,000 people living in Detroit, and finally at the turn of the 20th century, in about 1900, over 300,000 people lived in Detroit. So the growth had been just spectacular, and the change had been on a tremendous scale. You also have to think about the 1890s themselves. From 1890 to 1899, there was just a huge swell of reform and progress in Detroit. Hazen Pingree, many of you may know Hazen Pingree. Hands up. Yeah, Hazen Pingree, that's right. So Hazen Pingree was the mayor of Detroit for 10 years. He was probably the most progressive mayor that has ever been in the city of Detroit. He got us through a depression in 1893 by expanding our public welfare and by planting potatoes and vacant land so that people could eat during the Depression. He saw us through. There were streetcars in Detroit. There had been since the 1860s. They were drawn by horses until the 1890s. In the 1890s, they began to electrify. You also had street improvements in the 1890s. Before the 1890s, the streets were paved with wood. This was a terrible idea because the rain and the horse urine and everything just like soaked into the wood and made it smell really bad, and it didn't last very long, and sometimes it caught on fire. So like woodblock paving was just a disaster. They tore up all of the woodblock paving in the 1890s and replaced it with like the pavement we think about today. That made it easier for people to get around by bicycle, and soon by automobile in 1896. Just around the corner on Bagley Avenue in a tiny little workshop, a technologist, futurist, creative thinker named Henry Ford rolled out his little quadricycle, which was basically an engine on bicycle wheels. And that was a prototype of the popular, pragmatic consumer automobile. So in 1899, anything in Detroit is possible. And you look at that moment where Henry Ford rolls out his quadricycle and you think that's the moment when everything changed. But actually, everything had been changing up until that point and continues to change from there on. One thing about the 1890s that you have to think about is how much of the past we had to plow through in order to make the 1890s happen the way that they did. So starting in the 1870s, 1880s, you start to see this conversation happening in public. What do we do with our buildings that are in our way? So this building stands on land that used to belong to Lewis Cass, the governor of the Michigan Territory from 1813 to 1831. Anyway, this was his land, and this building was allowed to be built on his land. Lewis Cass had this house. It was on Larned between 1st and 2nd Street. It was one of the oldest houses, if not the oldest house, in the territory. It was at least as old as 1750, probably earlier than that. But nobody was using it. It was just kind of this disused memorial to Governor Cass. People said, this is part of our history. We need to save this. There was this campaign to move it to Grand Circus Park and kind of keep it there as like an old-timey museum. Like, oh, remember these old cabins where like Indian stuff was laying around? But that didn't work out. Nobody could really build the political will to do that. And they tore that house down in 1882. The same thing happened to the little log shack that Jean-Francois Hamtramck lived in 1804. That was over by Belle Isle. Hamtramck died. He was a great Revolutionary War hero. He died in 1804. He leaves this house. Nothing happens with it for the rest of the century. But people used to go there and like use it as a place to think about like what Detroit would have been like in that time. They would take a picnic and like their paint set, or later photography, and they would just enjoy like rustic, ramshackle, old-timey pioneer Detroit. They tore that house down in 1898. You just see this happen again and again. What do we do with this old stuff? There were houses on Jefferson, Griswold, and, what's that other big street? Woodward, where these were... Sorry. These houses were built like in the 1840s and 50s when people really just started getting rich and making mansions. Like they thought it was out in the country at the time, and of course, like less than 50 years later, it's being surrounded by development. Those houses were not even 50 years old in some cases, and they were being torn down because we needed to widen a street, or we wanted to put up a fancy new building or a hotel. And that conversation really comes to a pitch in the 1890s. So thinking about this building, one thing I really love about this building is that it was a building built for old-timers. This is where, if you were a Civil War veteran and you were part of the Grand Army of the Republic, you came here to hang out with your friends who you were war buddies with. Maybe you weren't friends during the war, but you made friends later and realized you had that in common. This is a place where people came to talk about history and to be connected by history and to think about the past and what that meant. And it was really nostalgic, and you saw that across Detroit society in the 1890s. You saw people who were really, really rich who were like, you know what I miss? I miss like the hunters and the trappers and the canoes, and like, wouldn't it be cool if you could have like a flintlock pistol and make your own dinner like out in the woods? Yeah, those were the good days. They totally weren't. I mean, the 1890s were a lot better by a lot of degrees, but you had this nostalgia creeping in, and we're dealing with that today too, I think. And I don't know that there's a good way or a bad way or a right way or a wrong way to think about this, right? Do we honor our past? Do we think about the future? Can we do both? I have no idea. I don't think there's an answer. But I want you to just kind of keep that in mind when Sean kind of talks a little bit about the history of the building itself and what Minefield is doing with the building. And when you're kind of out in the world and experiencing Detroit, think about your relationship to Detroit as a historical place, and what is right for you as you position yourself in this community. So that's about all I have, and I just want to throw in a really fun Tigers-related fact. And because we're in the Grand Army of the Republic building, in 1940, the year that the Tigers won the American League pennant, not the World Series, They were like a really old team. There were all these old people on the team, and they were affectionately referred to as the Grand Army of the Republic of Baseball. So maybe a good thing, good sign. All right, I'm gonna give it to Sean. Thank you.